Remember that critical scholars of the Bible are not respected in academic circles.
This creator is trying to argue that biblical scholars aren't respected outside their field because they make wild, unevidenced claims. But there's several things wrong with this. First of all, this creator presents absolutely no evidence of his own that this is the case, which is sort of peak ironic. And I don't even know what kind of evidence could be brought to bear in order to justify this statement, because it's a massive, sweeping generalization. You would need to literally poll everybody in every other field besides biblical scholarship and ask them whether or not they respect biblical scholarship, and they would have to know what biblical scholarship involves in order to be able to meaningfully weigh in on that. And obviously that kind of polling has not been done. So this creator is really just pulling this out of thin air because it sort of agrees with his own personal prejudices. But second of all, this is a problem because it fundamentally misunderstands what biblical scholarship is. Biblical scholarship is not really its own field. It's the convergence of multiple independent fields on the topic of biblical study. There really isn't a method that's unique to biblical scholars. Biblical scholars appropriate the methods from a great diversity of fields in the social sciences and humanities in order to understand the Bible better. For example, if a biblical scholar wanted to get at the world behind the text, the world that gives rise to and shapes the imagination of the text, then they would turn to the social sciences, sociology, anthropology, history, archaeology, psychology even, in order to understand who these biblical authors are, what they believed and practiced, and why they composed the texts that they did. If a biblical scholar wants to dive more deeply into a text, they're going to appropriate methods from the humanities. They're going to take things from linguistics and literary criticism and philosophical hermeneutics and theology in order to better understand biblical texts. And a biblical scholar can study the impact of these texts, the way that they've been received down through history, through the use of things like cultural studies and media studies, ethnographic surveys, even ideological criticism, again, philosophy, theology, many of the tools in the social sciences and humanities to try to understand how these texts have been interpreted and used throughout history. So a person could only think biblical scholarship is bad if they thought that all the constitutive parts of biblical scholarship is bad, and that would implicate literally everything in the social sciences and the humanities. And perhaps there is somebody out there who hates all the humanities and the social sciences. People do like to hate things, but I sincerely doubt, and have not been given any evidence to think otherwise, that this is characteristic of everybody in every field besides biblical scholarship. Certainly not those fields in the humanities and the social sciences that biblical scholars are drawing their methods from. This creator is making these wild, unjustified claims about biblical scholars simply because they don't like the conclusions that so many biblical scholars have come to. This is just personal prejudice imagined to be the common perception of other educated people. And we really see that in this next clip right here.
They make wild speculations with zero evidence and pass it off as fact. That's not the way modern scholarship works. It's not the way science works. There isn't a single manuscript or a single piece of archaeological evidence that would undermine Moses writing the Torah.
This creator claims that biblical scholars have invented the idea that Moses did not write the Pentateuch, the first 5 books of the Bible, without any evidence at all. If you've been following my channel for any length of time, you know that I talk about the authorship of the Pentateuch a fair amount. I'm a big proponent of what's called the neo-documentary hypothesis, which is one of the mainstream positions adopted by biblical scholars about the authorship of the Pentateuch. If you're interested in that topic or in other positions that Pentateuchal scholars take on the authorship of the Pentateuch, you can check out my playlist linked in my profile called Bible Sources. Very quickly, the neo-documentary hypothesis is the idea that the first 5 books of the Bible, the Pentateuch, were originally composed as 4 independent sources written in different times and different places across several centuries by different people and then edited together after the fact by somebody else. All the evidence for the neo-documentary hypothesis is therefore evidence against the idea that any single author, Moses included, could have written the Pentateuch. Let me give you 3 pieces of evidence that biblical scholars routinely discuss that preclude the possibility that Moses wrote the first 5 books of the Bible. Number 1, language. Biblical Hebrew, like any other language in the world, is not static. It changes and develops over time in accordance with its use. If Moses wrote the Pentateuch in the 15th or the 13th century BCE or wherever you want to put him, then what we would expect is that the Pentateuch would be entirely in the Hebrew appropriate for that century. But that's not at all what we have. Instead, the Hebrew of the Pentateuch shows centuries worth of development of a language scattered all over the place. For example, some of the earliest Hebrew in the Pentateuch, in a place like Exodus 15 and the Song of the Sea, has a lot in common with earlier Canaanite literature from the 11th century BCE or before, whereas some of the latest Hebrew in the Pentateuch, in places like the Holiness Code in Leviticus 17 to 26, that material has a lot more in common with the exilic era Hebrew of somebody like the prophet Ezekiel from 500 years after that stuff in the Song of the Sea. And all of this stuff is, in turn, centuries later than Moses was supposed to have lived. Saying Moses wrote the Pentateuch would be a bit like saying that Shakespeare wrote a text that has English from Pride and Prejudice, English from Lord of the Rings, and English from some Gen Z TikTok comment. Number 2, the Pentateuch has doublets in it. Doublets are narratively redundant and mutually contradictory stories. If you believe Richard Elliott Friedman, there's at least 30 of these in the Pentateuch. No single author would write a story and then write that same story again with contradictory details, because any point they were trying to make in the composition of that first story would then be undermined by that second story. Rather, these doublets are much better explained by having two independent authors compose their own version of a story, and then having somebody else come along later who's interested in preserving both these stories, edit them together. Some of these doublets in the Pentateuch are edited together back to back, like our two contradictory stories of creation, one in Genesis chapter 1 and then one in Genesis chapter 2, verse 4 and following. Some of the doublets in the Pentateuch are edited together with several chapters in between them, like the two stories of Jacob being renamed Israel, or the two stories of Jacob naming a place Bethel. And some of the doublets in the Pentateuch are edited together in interlocking ways, so that verse to verse we are switching between two sources, like our two contradictory flood stories between Genesis chapter 6 and 9, and our two contradictory stories about Joseph being sold into slavery in Egypt in Genesis 37. Number 3, ideological biases. Once we begin to separate these underlying sources in accordance with these doublets, what we see is that each of these independent sources has their own ideological biases, more ideological biases in different directions than a single person would have. For example, there are some passages in the Pentateuch that have a very clear bias in favor of the northern kingdom of Israel, and other passages that have a competing bias in favor of the southern kingdom of Judah. It doesn't make any sense at all for Moses to have either of these biases, living centuries before there was any monarchy at all, but it would make a lot of sense for authors who were living at the time when these kingdoms coexisted side by side to have these competing biases. Some passages seem to think that humanity always knew God's personal name, Yahweh. Other passages seem to think that Yahweh's name was revealed specially to Moses at one particular time and place. Some passages think that only descendants of Aaron should be priests, whereas other passages think the priesthood should be much broader than that. Some passages think that all cultic celebration and worship should be done in a single centralized place, whereas other passages seem to think it's okay to worship Yahweh anywhere. These competing ideological biases are best explained by having multiple independent authors writing on behalf of communities who have these different beliefs, and are not well explained at all by having a single author who existed long before any of these biases would be relevant at all. When I asked this creator for evidence that Moses wrote the Pentateuch, he said, well, people have claimed that Moses have wrote the Pentateuch for a long time. Appeals to tradition are fallacious, and they certainly don't count as good evidence for anything. Biblical scholars in general, and Pentateuchal specialists in particular, don't think that Moses wrote the Pentateuch, the first 5 books of the Bible. They believe instead that it's the combination of multiple independent sources and a variety of supplemental additions over the course of several centuries. And they believe this for evidential reasons. If you're interested in evidence like this, I would strongly recommend picking up Richard Elliott Friedman's book, Who Wrote the Bible?, which is a wonderful lay-level presentation of 7 different categories of evidence, far more than I can present in a single TikTok video, for this proposition that the Bible was not written by Moses, but instead by these independent authors. It's one thing to have prejudices against another field based on your own personal ignorance. It's another thing entirely to pretend that all educated people share those same personal prejudices. With just a little bit of reading and a little bit of a willingness to step outside our own comfort zone and confront our own unevidenced belief, we can have a much better view of other people's fields.